Hello, everybody. My name is John Rick Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today I wanted to share a fairly recent acquisition with you guys. This is a Ruger LC carbine in 10mm, which is an odd choice just all the way around. It's a bit of an odd gun, a bit of an odd caliber, and frankly, I bought it mostly because of the fact that it's a bit odd. I find myself being attracted to civilianized, kind of weird idiosyncratic guns lately. And this one definitely fits the bill on it. Now, as to the reason why I bought it, the reason has to do with my shooting situation. That is, the place that I used to go shooting at all the time had to be closed because there were some people that were shooting there that were abusing the place and not following proper shooting procedures, especially as it related to backstops. And there were some homes that were not too terribly far away that wound up having bullets land in places where you do not want bullets to land, we'll put it that way. And so they wound up shutting down that shooting area because there are people who didn't understand how to use a backstop. It's always because of the idiots that we can't have nice things. But in searching for alternative places to shoot, I found that a lot of them didn't have much in the way of range to deal with. And that is somewhat limiting for me because I like to shoot at still targets when I can. They're nicely reusable, they provide immediate feedback, etc., all the normal arguments for using steel targets insert there. But the problem is that steel targets are not really safe to use at close ranges, especially with high velocity weapons. The particular steel targets that I use, the manufacturer recommends that you don't use them within 25 yards at all. 25 yards is their minimum. And they would say that if the muzzle velocity is above 1,500 feet per second, it should be really more like 100 yards in order to minimize the ricochet risk, because that's one of the risks that you run if you're shooting at hard targets, is there can be a ricochet, and the closer that target is to you, the more likely that ricochet hits you. And so, like I said, they recommend 25 yards as a minimum safe distance for their targets. And if your muzzle velocity is in excess of 1,500 feet per second, they recommend going all the way out to 100. But like I said, a lot of the places that I found to shoot in lieu of my old favorite shooting place, not all of them go out to 100 yards. And so I kind of wound up looking for guns that would be okay to shoot at close hard targets with. It would have a muzzle velocity that was under 1,500 feet per second, but also could be such that if I wanted to, I could load them up in such a way that they would have a muzzle energy that would be at least comparable with an intermediate rifle cartridge. And what I came up with was 10mm. There's a lot of common 10mm rounds out there that are frankly pretty lightly loaded. They're more like 40 Smith & Wesson loads that frankly don't have a very high muzzle velocity, even when put in a gun like the Ruger LC carbine with a 16-inch barrel. The gun feeds through the pistol grip. That's an actual mag well there. And so the barrel comes all the way back here. And so even though this looks a little short for a rifle, it is actually a proper 16-inch barrel. But even out of a 16-inch barrel, there's a lot of 10mm loads that are lightly loaded enough that you'll still stay under that 1,500 feet per second threshold, and it still be relatively safe to use them at close distances. However, there are also some more substantial loads out there, particularly ones made by, say, Buffalo Bore, Double Tap, Underwood, that are considerably more powerful, especially out of a 16-inch barrel. What I have for plinking ammunition is just the MagTech 180 grain stuff, and out of a 16-inch barrel, this stuff usually doesn't even top 1,400 feet per second, let alone 1,500 feet per second. So it's a good plinking load in terms of being able to shoot at close targets with it. But, like I said, with the Underwood ammunition and stuff like that, there's a lot of those that will go well in excess of 1,500 feet per second and give you a lot more muzzle energy. A lot of them getting into the mid 800s in terms of foot-pounds of muzzle energy, with a few, like one or two of them, that can get above 1,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy out of a 16-inch barrel. And that's basically why I wound up with this gun. If I put in a lot of the common plinking ammunition, it's perfectly safe to use at relatively close steel targets. Like I said, there is a minimum that the manufacturer recommends, but it's slow enough that the recusite risk is very minimal. But at the same time, if I wanted it to be able to do more substantial things, maybe not quite on par with a true intermediate rifle caliber, but I can at least get close to that kind of power with a more substantial load in it, like the double tap or the Underwood or something like that, and have a punch that's pretty close to an intermediate rifle cartridge at that point. And that's why I wound up with it. But it is still a rather bizarre gun. There are, of course, other alternatives out there in terms of 10 mil, not a ton, but there are a few. In terms of cost, the main competitors to this one would be the Kel-Tec Sub 2000. They have some 10 millimeter versions of those out there. And there's also the Smith & Wesson FPC that they also have some 10 millimeter versions for. I don't like either of those because, frankly, they're really ergonomically kind of awkward. The Sub 2000, if I remember right, is still a crossbolt safety. I really do not like crossbolt safeties. I really, really don't. So crossbolt safeties, their charging handle on those ones are actually in basically the stock of the gun, because those ones have the bolts basically in the stock, not entirely dissimilar to how an AR-15 has the buffers in its stock. They kind of run their bolts that way in the Sub 2000 and in the Smith & Wesson FPC. And that means that the charging handle is also basically on the stock. And that is a really awkward way to try to charge a gun. And those ones also tend to have fairly heavy springs in them. When I go shooting, I like to be able to shoot with other people if I can. I haven't been shooting in a very long time, actually. But when I do go shooting, it's nice to have other people there and to be able to shoot with other people. And I want it to be a relatively enjoyable process for them. And having a gun with awkward controls that charges underneath the stock is not really a great thing if you want something that's going to be usable by a fairly wide range of people. So this one, even though its controls are not entirely customary for a modern rifle, they are good enough that they're not going to be too bad for most people. In terms of controls, you have what is essentially a typical handgun safety. Flip down is fire, up is safe, and that is mirrored on the other side. I'm trying not to muzzle my upstairs neighbors here. So you still have the safety, and then there's a bolt stop, bolt release next to it like you would see on a lot of handguns. It's basically standard handgun controls. However, there's one detail I do want to get to in a second, but I'll also talk about the other control while I'm here. And this button right here is a normal magazine release for fairly typical pistols will have their magazine release here. And you also see the charging handle, which is in a fairly standard place for a Western type fighting rifle. A left side charging handle that does not reciprocate. That's fairly typical, that's fairly normal. But getting back to the arrangement between the safety and the bolt stop, bolt release, there is a problem there, in that when the safety is disengaged, it's actually a little hard to get your hand on the bolt stop, bolt release. And Ruger came up with an interesting way to fix that problem. I personally think that it actually creates some ergonomic confusion. But their solution was on the other side of the gun to put a button right here where you normally have a mag release on most modern fighting rifles. But instead of it being a mag release, that is actually an alternative way to drop the bolt. It is not a bolt stop. You can't use it to lock the bolt back, but you can use it to drop the bolt. And like I said, on the other side, those two controls are really close to each other, and it can be a little hard to disengage the bolt stop from there. And that's why Ruger put that button on the other side. I personally don't like it because, like I said, it's exactly where you would expect the mag release to be on a more typical fighting rifle. So it's a little ergonomically confusing, but it's not nearly as bad as, say, the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 or the Smith & Wesson FPC. So that would be the low end of the market that this thing would be competing with. On the higher end of the market, the more expensive options, you get things like the Chris Vector in 10 millimeter, you get the CMG, the Banshee in 10 millimeter. I don't think they've made a Descent version of that yet. But there are CMMGs out there that have it. There's also Strebog that has put out 10 millimeter versions. And the problem with most of those is, of course, well, number one, expense. Chris Vectors are not cheap guns. Even the Strebog, even though it's more affordable than some of the other options out there, they're not super cheap. And the CMMGs are usually not terribly cheap either. So just from a price perspective, this one becomes a lot more appealing. Most of these LC carbines, depending on the particular caliber that you get and the particular version, whether the actual carbine or the charger, and to be clear, this one in 10 millimeter, they have not made a charger version for yet. For those who are familiar with Ruger's naming system, the charger name is applied to something that is basically started life as a rifle, but they remade into a legal pistol version of. So there are 1022 chargers. There are PC chargers. Instead of PC carbines, they're PC chargers. This one is an LC carbine, but in this particular caliber, 10 millimeter, they haven't made a charger version of this one yet. But there are other LC, or I should say one other LC carbine that they have made a charger version of, and that is the 5.7x28 version. That one has a charger version. The 10 mil does not yet. I would actually be very interested in them making a charger version of this, but we don't have it yet. All right, so like I said, the other higher end competitors are there, like Strebog, Chris, CMMG. They do make higher end versions of 10 millimeter guns, but they're of course more expensive. And another problem with a lot of them is that either they're not rifle legal, they're not legal rifles, they're in the category of being pistols, or they're fairly awkward in a rifle form. Like the Chris Vectors, for example, I do think that they do have a rifle version of their Chris Vector in 10 millimeter, but it is a very awkward gun. It has huge, giant 16-inch barrel sticking out the front end, and it makes the gun relatively large and awkward by comparison. Ruger, on the other hand, yeah, this is still a legal rifle. It has a 16-inch barrel, but because they went with a magazine that fits into the mag well, they're able to bring the barrel back a little bit from where it would be in a more conventional rifle. In a more conventional rifle, the mag well would be right in front of the trigger guard here. But since they were able to move it back to the pistol grip and use basically pistol controls, they get to move the barrel a little bit further back. And so even though it has a rifle length 16-inch barrel in it, the overall length of the gun is actually not too bad. With the stock in its longest position, it's a little over 30.5 inches. I usually keep it just one place short of the longest one. So for me, it's just a little over 30 inches long. And in terms of having something that would be more suitable for a close quarters type gun, 30 inches is not too bad. Shorter is better in that regard if you want something that's really CQB adapted. But if you're trying to maintain legal rifle status and still be relatively short, something like this is going to be superior to the Chris offerings or the CMMG options or even the Strebog options, because either they don't have a legal rifle version. Like I said, as far as I know, Strebog does not have a rifle version of their 10 millimeter offering. It's basically only the pistol or SBR options that you have right now. Chris does, I think, have a carbine version of it, but it's a very long, awkward one because their magwell is further forward. And CMMG, they might have a legal rifle version of it, but again, it's going to be a little bit longer because the magwell is in front of the trigger guard rather than being in the pistol grip. So that's basically why I wound up with this over the other options. 10 millimeter itself is a cartridge that can have a relatively low muzzle velocity with certain rounds, especially a lot of the plinking ammunition, or with some of the more boutique rounds, you can have it hit a lot harder to the point where it at least starts to compare with some of the intermediate rifle cartridges. Not that it's really going to behave the same way, but in terms of muzzle energy, you can get pretty close with it. So 10 millimeter was the choice because of that, and the Ruger was the choice because the layout and controls on it are better than the layout and controls that you get with the Sub 2000 or the FPC, and this gun also maintains the legal rifle status in a shorter overall package than some of the higher end manufacturers would be able to offer if they offer a legal rifle package at all. All right, so that's why I wound up with this gun in particular versus the others. Now, there's, of course, one major difference from how this came out of the box, and that is out of the box it comes up with a couple of basic pop-up sights, very similar to the Magpul pop-up sights, but they're Ruger branded. They were perfectly fine as pop-up sights go. However, I personally like proper optics, either a red dot or in this case a prism optic that's just a 1x prism optic. This one is one of the Gideon Advocates, and I really like it because I have an astigmatism, and a fairly significant astigmatism, and these things will still allow me to see the target very clearly and also allow me to see the reticle very clearly, which I don't get with a normal red dot. And so I've really begun liking these things. So that's the major change that I made there, was the sighting system. Take off the old pop-up sights, put on a prism scope instead. And the nice thing about prism scopes is that they are basically their own backup. On red dot sighted guns, I would very much still keep the pop-up sights that were on there. And I'm not, please make sure you understand this, I'm not making advice, giving advice for you guys. I'm telling you what my thought process is and what I'm doing. I'm not telling you guys how you should set up your guns or anything relative to you guys. I don't know your situation, anything. I'm not making advice for you guys. I'm just telling you what I do and what I'm thinking. Okay, my thought process, if I had a conventional red dot on this, would be to keep the pop-up sights because the red dot can go out if the battery goes bad. If the battery dies and you don't have backup pop-up sights or some kind of backup sighting system on the gun with a red dot, you could wind up basically with no sighting system, and that would not be optimal. So on guns that I use red dots, I usually have a second optic or second sighting system of some kind. Either pop up open sights or make it so that one optic can come off and use another optic system that's built into the gun, like on AKs, the vast majority of them, very, very, very seldom have I seen an exception to this. The vast majority of AKs that are out there usually have built-in iron sights. And they also, a lot of the newer ones will have a side rail that you can put on there where you can put another kind of option, whether it be a red dots or some kind of magnified optic, whatever. But if you take the optic off of that side rail, you're basically back to the default iron sights that an AK has. And I've done that on my AKs as well. You know, that's the contingency. If the main optic goes down for some reason, I at least still have the iron sights as a backup. That's especially important in cases where it's electron powered, like I said, for red dots or holographic sights or anything where you do not have a reticle. If you don't have power into that thing, a backup sighting system of some kind is a really good idea. I personally, though, I'm not making suggestions for you guys, personally, I don't worry about that when it comes to prism optics, because they actually don't need power for the reticle to work. Yes, most of them do have a power option, and it will allow the reticle to turn usually either red or green. Is usually the default color of a lot of them, but you can actually turn the power completely off on these things, completely take out the battery, and still have a reticle. It'll be a black reticle because it's not being illuminated, but you'll still have a usable reticle. So with prism optics, I usually don't put backup sights on the gun because even if the battery goes dead, I actually still have a usable reticle. It's not going to give me as good a contrast, but backup sights, pop-up sights, iron sights, they don't usually have very good contrast either. They're usually just black or maybe black with a little white dot or something like that. So I don't usually worry about it when I have prism scopes on there. So that is a change that I made. As to basic specs, as I have already said, it's a rifle length barrel, so it's a little over 16 inches. The weight of the empty gun before anything gets attached to it is 7.4 pounds, so it's a little on the heavy side. It's, like I said, it's not really the most practical gun, and I got it more for recreational use and to fill a very, very specific niche of having something that could shoot slow if I wanted it to and shoot a bit faster if I wanted it to. Excuse me. Very particular little niche. Not really the most practical gun in general, but still interesting. Like I said, 16-inch barrel, 7.4 pounds. naked and unloaded. And the trigger pull on this one, it's already been checked and cleared off camera, but it's always nice to be extra safe. The trigger pull is not great. There's definitely a little bit of take up, not much. You get into resistance, squeeze, and it actually breaks. Not too bad. It's not terribly spongy, but it is definitely on the heavy side. On my trigger pull scale, it comes in at 6.25 pounds. Not the worst thing ever, but not super light either. Now, is that going to matter a whole lot on a pistol caliber weapon? Probably not, to be honest. Not really that big of a deal. So there is that. The stock does indeed fold, and it holds its position fairly well. Pretty typical in that regard. This stock does superficially resemble an AR stock, but it's not actually compatible with AR stocks, just so you know. And the mechanism, the folding mechanism, when you first get it out of the box is really stiff. What they're designed it to be is that once it's folded, you actually lift up on the stock itself and pull it out, and that's the way that it's intended from the factory to be used. However, if you just directly pull it the first few times, you'll actually bend. I'm not sure how well you guys will be able to see here, but there's a little bit of interaction on the hinge mechanism. There's just a little bit of an angle that has to overcome to come out. That's why it doesn't flop too badly. But if you pull it hard out without consciously trying to raise it to overcome that little hump, let's see if I can actually intentionally raise it and intentionally range it. Can't talk. Intentionally raise it and then swing it over. It will maintain higher tension, but if you just yank it out the first few times, that little divot that you saw there will actually bend a little bit, and it'll become a lot easier to pull out. And at this point, locking it and unlocking it is not a challenge at all. But out of the box, it can be rather difficult. I'm not sure if that made a whole lot of sense as to what I was trying to say there, but that is the case. Out of the box, it's hard. If you just stubbornly pull through it, you'll bend the sliding piece enough that it will start becoming a lot easier. All right, there's that. And then in terms of takedown, this is one of the Rugers that I actually kind of like. There's still a little bit of a quirk into disassembling it, but for the most part, I actually like the disassembly on this gun. So go ahead and make sure that the gun is charged such that the hammer is in its locked back position, which is the same case with a lot of large format guns. When you disassemble them, you should have the hammer locked back. So make sure that, of course, that the gun is empty. And like I said, it was checked and cleared off camera. But magwell is empty. I can look into the chamber and see that it is clear. So nothing in the magwell, nothing in the chamber. Make sure that it's been charged so that the hammer is locked back. And then once you do that, on the opposite side, there is a little pin out front, and you can use just about any ad hoc tool to punch out that pin. All that I'm doing right now is I'm just using an intermediate rifle cartridge. This is 7.62x39, but basically anything that can work as a punch will work here. Go ahead and punch out that pin. Go ahead and pull it out, and it is a retained pin. Once you've got it pulled out, then you're going to take the lower assembly, the pistol grip assembly, and you're going to pull it towards the back of the gun slightly. It's only about a half an inch or so, but pull it back slightly, and then once you do, it will lift off from the gun. Go ahead and put the main part of the gun to the side for right now so we can look at this. And this is basically just an overgrown pistol lower. Essentially, that's all that it really is. You will see that the feed ramp is built into the lower, as is the ejector there. It's built into the lower as well. But other than that, it's pretty conventional in terms of just being more or less a standard pistol lower. One thing that I did find that was odd on this is that the hammer And you guys are probably not going to be able to see it super well on camera, of course, but part of the assembly for the hammer is actually such that it should be greased. Not just normal gun oil, but there's a part on the hammer that actually needs to be greased from time to time, which again goes to Ruger being kind of a weird company when it comes to a lot of the things that they do. But yeah, from time to time you will need to remember to grease that spot in the hammer, and the manual actually shows where that spot is. But yeah, weird ditty, I'm not sure why, but that is the case there. And this little piece right here is the hammer. It's not a very big hammer. It doesn't really need to be, but yeah, that is the hammer, and everything else is basically standard pistol lower type stuff. All right, then to continue the disassembly, you will now have access to the main innards of the gun, and the main thing here, of course, would be the bolts. And it's actually a 2-piece bolt. And so to take out the bottom piece, you're going to take the charging handle, pull it towards you, and then once you have the charging handle pulled, you're going to pull out the bottom part of the bolt as one unit. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and set the gun aside for the moment. All right, so this is the first part of the bolt. It's 10 millimeters, so it needs a pretty substantial bolt. This is one part of it, and it is a telescoping bolt. So the barrel actually fits inside of the bolts, and the bolts is wrapped around the barrel. And this is a very old style of bolt. It's been used at least since the days of the Uzi. The Uzi is probably the most famous pistol caliber weapon that used a telescoping bolt. And it's the same basic concept there. So the face is all the way back here, and most of the bolt, of course, protrudes forward of that. Another little oddity is the ejector actually has a little lever that you can externally access and press on to release it. This is a direct blowback gun, and so the extractor, did I say extractor? Extractor or ejector? I'm sorry. This is the extractor. The extractor doesn't actually forcibly extract the cartridge in a blowback gun. In a blowback gun, the cartridge itself is actually being pushed by the explosion that goes on in the chamber, and so the casing is actually what's acting on the bolts. It's not the bolt acting on the casing, it's the other way around. And so it's actually the casing that kicks the bolt back. And so the extractor, its job is basically just to hold the casing in place so that when you get to the ejector, it's in the proper location so that it can get ejected properly. But it's not meant to be used under force. And so to help keep people from using it under force, they made it fairly easy to move out of place. So that if you ever in a spot where you get a stuck casing or something like that, you can simply release the extractor, pull the bolt back, and then use a cleaning rod or something like that to tap the casing out of place, because you're not supposed to actually use the extractor to pull a stuck case out. Kind of a weird little thing. Not what you would see on other designs, of course, that are not direct blowback, but that is the case with this one. So there's the first piece of the bolts, and this little lip that we see on the front end locks into the front piece of the bolt. So let's go ahead and get that out next. In order to get the second piece of the bolt out, you need to first remove the recoil spring and buffer. And that is in the rear here. This little thing that's moving right here is the buffer, and it's of course connected to the spring. So, and it comes directly out. And there comes the recoil spring. And it's a fairly typical recoil spring and buffer pad there. There's not a whole lot to it. It's pretty standard. And then the forward part of the bolt will slide back. And now you can pull it free. There we go. All right, and there is the forward part of the bolts. And as you can see, it wraps around the barrel. That's why there's the huge hole in it. There's the dovetail for the little lip that we saw before. And other than that, and it also has, of course, the hole for the recoil rod and spring. But other than that, it's basically just a giant mass that's meant to hold the power of the 10 millimeter in place long enough for it to safely cycle. But yeah, it's a very simple design. And this is the fully field stripped gun. You have the lower, which is a lot like a standard pistol lower. You have the rear section of the bolts with the bolt face and all of that. And then you have the front piece of the bolt that the other one fits into. You have the recoil rod and spring. And then you have the remainder of the gun. And now you can see in there a lot. And there was a piece that fell out here. Sorry. The piece that fell out is a little plastic piece that fits into the front of the gun. You don't actually have to take it out for cleaning purposes, but sometimes it falls out on its own. Oops, I think I got that a little too tight. Yeah. There we go. If you don't get it quite on the rails, it will be a little too tight to slide. All right, but in terms of what's actually necessary to remove, that's all you got there. They did design the gun so that if you unscrew the screw right in here on the stock, there's actually a little hole in the back of the receiver that you can use to put a cleaning rod through if you want to do it that way. However, I'm going to probably not do that. Instead, I'm going to use the same technique that I use with another gun that disassembles similarly, which would be the CZ Scorpion. It also doesn't really have a proper back area. And so on it, I usually use either a bore snake or I put the cleaning rod through the muzzle end and then just simply screw on the brush once it comes through and then pull it forward so that you're getting that forward motion on the brush like you're supposed to have. If you want to brush it out conventionally, you just unscrew the stock and there's a little hole underneath that you can use for a conventional cleaning rod. But like I said, I'm probably just going to do the either the reverse cleaning rod or the bore snake method. All right, and then reassembling it isn't really all that difficult. First, we will take the front piece of the bolts, make sure that it is oriented so that you can see the dovetail part as you're inserting it. Then go ahead and push it forward all the way. Actually, I'm going to bring that back just a little bit so it's a little easier to find the proper hole for the recoil spring. So the recoil spring, I'm going to push it into that hole first, and then go ahead and pop it into place. Nice. Go ahead and test the charging handle right now. Make sure that the recoil spring is actually in the proper hole and all that. And then go ahead and pull back on the charging handle. Then we'll drop in the other piece of the bolt so that the lip fits into the little dovetail. There we go. That is great. So it should look like that. And then we put back on the lower, and the lower has a couple of tabs. Let's see if I can show that to you guys. So on the front, there are a couple little tabs. That's a little tab just over on the other side. And then on the back end, there are a couple little tabs that fit into corresponding notches in the receiver. So here's one notch, here's the other notch, and of course there's corresponding notches on the other opposite sides. Oh, sorry. So yeah, here's a notch, there's a notch, and then the notches over here. And so I just line up the tabs with the notches. Slides in fairly nicely, and then I need to push it forward towards the front of the gun. Take the cross bolt pin, slide it through. Give it a quick function check, and we are good to go. That is a much better assembly and disassembly than you're going to get with either the FPC or the Sub 2000. And because it's direct blowback, you don't have some of the other added mechanical intricacies of, say, the Chris Vector that has the Super V system, that has kind of a linkage thing going on, or the Sub 2000 with its roller delay system, or even the CMMG, which is basically a modified AR bolt carrier group. This one's pretty simple and straightforward. It's not all that hard to take apart or reassemble, which makes it preferable in that regard. It is weird that they have the hole in the back that you have to unscrew the buttstock for, but like I said, there's other ways to clean the barrel other than using a conventional push rod. You can use a pull rod, or you can use a bore snake, and then you don't have to worry about taking off the stock at all. One pin, take out the rear part of the bolt, take out the recoil rod assembly, take out the front part of the bolts. The little cap up here might fall out because it's not really held in with anything, but that's easy enough to get back on. Not really a big deal. It's a fairly simple and straightforward design. I haven't had the chance to shoot it yet, so I don't know how reliable it is, but it is a fairly simple design. And if you're in the market for a 10mm carbine, it does have some advantages over some of the competition just in terms of how it's built, the size, and all that. All right, that's all I got for now. Hopefully a shooting video will come about in the not too distant future, but that is good enough for now. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to yield to him, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.